Welcome to The Cauldron, a podcast hosted by Ed Bolden-Greer, the creator of Ravens Vail. In each episode, Ed will have free-flowing conversations about horror, life, culture, and personal growth. Expect to hear from storytellers, authors, horror experts, life gurus, thought leaders, and influencers. The Cauldron is a place where concoctions of a lot of ideas are brewed down to potions that are sometimes important and useful, sometimes eccentric and bizarre, but always just what you need. The Cauldron podcast may contain explicit language and thematic elements not suitable for all audiences. Listener discretion is advised.
Well, hey there, family. Welcome to the new Ravens Vail Cauldron. I'm your host, Ed Bolden-Greer. I'm also the creator of the Ravens Vail podcast. Today's podcast is a little different. The staff at Ravens Vail has received multiple requests for us to talk about our origin story, and they've encouraged me to do that in today's podcast. So, if I'm going to tell the story, I'm going to go all the way back. I was born in a small town in East Tennessee where I lived until I was 18 years old. Immediately after high school, I left and have lived in several places before making Knoxville, Tennessee my home. I've been involved in the healthcare and complementary healthcare industries most of my adult life. My husband, Jeryd, who works with me on the podcast, and I own a school in Knoxville where we work long hours. In fact, for the past 20 years, I've worked between 10 and 16 hours a day, every day, to make sure we were successful. It's important to note that I absolutely love what I do, and I never saw any of that work as sacrifice. I would take time off when I felt like I needed it, but for the most part, I worked. 2020 was hard for us all. Businesses closed left and right, and we knew our business wasn't immune from the risks. So we dug in and worked harder. The outcome, our business survived and has even thrived. In 2022, though, something changed. I still loved what I was doing, but I had lost my edge. I sought out expert advice and came to the conclusion that I was headed towards burnout. To be clear, burnout was something I had never contemplated or even understood. Things like that happen to other people, not me. But here I was, barreling down the road to burnout. I began contemplating and analyzing why, at this time in my life, was I experiencing this. I took some good advice from friends that had experienced the same thing. I cut back on my hours. I took some long overdue vacations. I made more time for friends and family. But there was still something missing. That's when a really good friend of mine reminded me that I'd literally stopped doing anything creative outside of my work. I'm going to tell you, that realization hit pretty hard. For the last 10 years, I hadn't done anything creative of any significance. I used to paint and write and draw. I loved trying new mediums to express my creative side. But slowly over time, I had eliminated all of my creative outlets because I filled all of my time with work. I was also getting depressed. So one day I told Jeryd I had to make some changes. He asked me what I meant, and when I said I had to get back to something creative, he asked me what I wanted to do. I thought for a moment, and I told him I'd been thinking about doing a podcast for a while. But I also really had a desire to get back into writing horror. He, in his loving way, said, "Whatever it takes to make you happy, do it. I'll support you 1,000%. So over the next few weeks, I investigated starting a podcast and thought about plots for horror stories, but I just kind of felt lost. For the first time in my life, I couldn't make a decision. I explained my frustration to Jeryd, and he said, let's take a few days and think through all of the possibilities. So I agreed and started a list of pros and cons of each. Jeryd was co-teaching a night class at this time in our lives, training new instructors. One night he came home from work and he was all excited and he said, I'm sending you a text with a link to a podcast. I think you should take a look at it. So while he showered, I clicked on the link and listened to an episode and then another and then another. When he was out of the shower, he came to the family room and could hear that I was listening to the podcast. He smiled at me and said, "What do you think?" And I said, "I think you're a genius." He'd gone out and found the answer to my dilemma, a horror anthology podcast. And that's where the story begins. Over the past 6 months, we've traveled all over the country, going to horror cons and expos to promote the podcast. We've met a bunch of great people. Today's episode is also about the improvements we're making to our podcast. And I wanted to briefly explain what's going on. Now, for those of you who have been faithful listeners since we began, don't get upset. Ravens Vail is not going anywhere. We're not changing anything about our storyline or anything like that. As you may or may not know, we're a relatively young podcast network produced by Small Raven Media. We launched our first episode in June of 2023. For those of you who might be new to our podcast family, or just a little confused about our naming conventions, Ravens Vail is both a brand and a podcast network that has 3 distinct channels. Ravens Vail is on most podcast platforms like Podbean, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon, just to name a few. When I initially envisioned the entire concept for Ravens Vail, I wanted to develop a space to tell the Ravens Vail story that I wanted to create. I wanted to provide a platform for other writers and storytellers to tell their stories. And I wanted a space to talk about horror, life, culture, and personal growth. So we created a network that has 3 channels. Our first channel is the Ravens Vail podcast, which we release monthly. These episodes continue and expand the ongoing story within the Ravens Vail universe. We're currently in our first season, and quite honestly, we've been overwhelmed by the positive response. Our second channel is called the Ravens Vail Coven. It's an anthology podcast full of stories carefully created by the Ravens Vail staff from folks who submit their original scary stories. Our third channel is the Ravens Vail Cauldron, our weekly hybrid show that consists of free-flowing conversations about horror, life, culture, and personal growth. But I wasn't sure what I wanted to do with the Cauldron when we first started. So we basically recorded a couple of episodes as companions to the Ravens Vail story, but it just never felt right, and it just didn't hit the way I wanted it to. For several months, we've been working on a new format for the Ravens Vail Cauldron. We've styled it to be more like a listener-driven talk show. It's going to be a hybrid podcast somewhere between a talk show and a documentary. We really think you're going to like it. Our next episode is going to be the start of a 6-part series about the 5 darkest urban legends of Appalachia. I'll be joined by my good friend Jacob Garner, who will co-host the series with me. Jacob suffers from phasmophobia, an intense and prodigious fear of the supernatural and paranormal. This should be fun. We hope you'll give us a listen. I hope today's brief episode has helped answer some of the many questions we've received over the past 6 months. I would like to close today's episode by saying thank you to all our listeners. And thank you, Jeryd. The past 6 months have been a lifesaver. And as always, family, until next time, see you soon.
The Cauldron is a production of Small Raven Media. Today's episode was hosted by Jeryd Bolden-Greer. Audio engineering and sound design by DeVan at Nicky D Sound. Copyrighted 2024, Small Raven Media. All rights reserved.